The rain hadn't stopped in Seattle for 6 days straight. November 1991, the kind of Pacific Northwest rain that seeps into your bones and stays there, cold and relentless. But in the basement of the Crocodile Cafe on 2nd Avenue, something electric was happening. The air, thick with cigarette smoke and the sweat of bodies pressed too close together, the smell of spilled beer mixing with the dampness that followed everyone in from the street. Layne Staley stood at the edge of the stage, his long blonde hair falling across his face like a curtain, hiding eyes that held secrets the world wasn't ready to hear. 24 years old, rail-thin, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better days and jeans with holes that weren't fashion statements, but evidence of a life lived on the margins. His voice, when it emerged from the chaos of Jerry Cantrell's guitar and Mike Starr's bass, was something otherworldly. Something that made people stop talking mid-sentence and turn toward the stage with a recognition they couldn't quite name. This was before Alice in Chains became a household name. Before MTV started calling Seattle the center of the musical universe. Before the word grunge became a marketing term that record executives used to sell rebellion to suburban teenagers. This was the raw, unfiltered beginning of something that would define a generation. The crowd pressed closer as Layne's voice climbed through We Die Young. That haunting melody that seemed to predict futures none of them wanted to imagine. His vocal style was unlike anything happening in rock music at the time. Not the theatrical wail of metal singers, not the monotone rebellion of punk vocalists. This was something more honest, more vulnerable. A voice that could whisper secrets in your ear one moment and tear your heart out the next. In the audience that night, barely visible in the shadows, near the bar, Kurt Cobain nursed a beer and watched with the intensity of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. Nirvana's Nevermind had just been released 2 months earlier, and suddenly everyone in Seattle with a guitar and an attitude was being courted by major labels. But Kurt knew talent when he heard it, and what he was hearing from Layne Staley was the real thing. After the show, in the narrow alley behind the club where the rain collected in puddles that reflected the neon signs from the street, Layne and Kurt found themselves sharing a cigarette and talking about music with the kind of passionate intensity that only comes from people who've found their calling. Kurt's voice, usually so guarded in interviews, opened up as he talked about the Seattle scene, about how they were all part of something bigger than themselves, something that was about to change everything. "Your voice, man," Kurt said, exhaling smoke into the cold air. "It's like you're singing from someplace the rest of us can't reach." Layne smiled, that rare, genuine smile that his closest friends knew, not the practiced one he would later wear for cameras and interviews. "It's the only place I know how to sing from," he replied. The Seattle music scene in 1991 was a tight-knit community built on authenticity and mutual respect. These weren't musicians trying to become rock stars, they were artists expressing something true about their experience, about growing up in the shadow of Mount Rainier with the constant rain and the feeling that the rest of the world had forgotten they existed. Soundgarden had been grinding away for years, with Chris Cornell's 4-octave range setting a standard for vocal excellence that pushed everyone around him to reach deeper into themselves. Chris and Layne developed a friendship built on mutual admiration and shared understanding of what it meant to carry the emotional weight of a generation in your voice. They would meet at the Sit and Spin, a combination laundromat and cafe on 4th Avenue, drinking coffee that was too strong and talking about music theory and vocal techniques while their clothes tumbled dry. Chris, with his classical training and technical precision, would listen in amazement as Layne described his completely intuitive approach to singing. "I don't think about it," Layne would explain, his hands moving as he talked, trying to capture something ephemeral. "It's like the songs already exist somewhere, and I'm just opening my mouth to let them out." This natural gift, combined with Jerry Cantrell's heavy, hypnotic guitar work, created a sound that was both crushing and beautiful, dark and uplifting, angry and vulnerable all at once. The breakthrough moment came in early 1992, when Man in the Box started getting radio play, and suddenly everyone wanted to know who Alice in Chains was. But even as fame began to knock on their door, Layne remained grounded in the community that had shaped him. He could be found on any given Tuesday night at the Vogue, a tiny club in Belltown, watching other local bands play, always supportive, always encouraging. Stone Gossard from Pearl Jam would later describe those early days as magical, a time when success didn't matter as much as the music itself. Layne had this quality where he made everyone around him want to be better, Stone remembered. Not through competition, but through inspiration. His voice was so pure, so emotional, that it challenged all of us to dig deeper into our own art. The recording sessions for Dirt in 1992 revealed the full scope of Layne's vocal abilities. Producer Dave Jordan, who had worked with Jane's Addiction and Red Hot Chili Peppers, was unprepared for what he encountered when Layne stepped into the vocal booth. Take after take, Layne would deliver performances that were technically perfect but emotionally different each time, as if he was discovering new depths in the songs with every attempt. Rooster, the haunting ballad Jerry wrote about his father's experience in Vietnam, became a showcase for Layne's ability to convey complex emotions through the subtle vocal choices. The way he sang, "Yeah, here come the rooster, you know he ain't gonna die," wasn't just melody. It was storytelling, character acting, and raw emotion, all compressed into a few seconds of sound that could make grown men cry. The success of Dirt brought Alice in Chains to the forefront of the grunge explosion. But Layne never lost sight of his roots. He would insist on playing small Seattle venues between major tours, always returning to the community that had nurtured his growth. The Off-Ramp, the Rocket, the Vogue, these weren't just clubs to him. They were sacred spaces where music mattered more than money. As the grunge movement exploded into the mainstream, Layne found himself at the center of something he never asked for. The voice of a generation. Kids from suburban malls would come to Alice in Chains concerts wearing flannel shirts and Doc Martens, and trying to capture something authentic in a world that increasingly felt fake to them. And Layne, with his ethereal voice and haunted lyrics, became their prophet of pain and beauty. But the pressure of representing something larger than himself began to weigh on Layne in ways that weren't immediately visible. The shy kid from Kirkland who just wanted to sing found himself expected to be a spokesman for disaffected youth, a role he never auditioned for and didn't particularly want. The music industry machine, hungry for the next big thing, began to commodify the very authenticity that had made the Seattle scene special in the first place. Eddie Vedder, who had become close friends with Layne through their shared experience of sudden fame, would spend hours talking with him about the strange position they found themselves in. "We're selling rebellion to kids who want to buy rebellion," Eddie observed during one of their conversations at the Delancey, a dive bar where musicians could drink without being bothered by fans or industry people. The golden period of Seattle grunge was brief but intense, lasting roughly from 1991 to 1994. During those 3 years, Layne Staley's voice became synonymous with a sound and a feeling that captured something essential about American youth in the early 1990s. His harmonies with Jerry Cantrell created some of the most beautiful and brutal music of the decade, songs that were simultaneously heavy enough for metalheads and melodic enough for mainstream radio. When Kurt Cobain died, in April 1994, the Seattle music community lost more than just a talented musician. They lost a piece of their innocence. The media attention that followed was intense and often exploitative, with journalists descending on Seattle looking for the next Kurt Cobain, or trying to paint all of Seattle's musicians with the same brush of tortured artistry and potential self-destruction. Layne felt the weight of this scrutiny differently than some of his peers. While Eddie Vedder and Chris Cornell were natural public speakers who could articulate their thoughts in interviews, Layne was naturally introverted, more comfortable expressing himself through music than through words. The constant questions about drugs, depression, and death felt invasive and reductive, as if his entire artistic output could be explained through tabloid psychology. The 1996 MTV Unplugged performance would become Alice in Chains' final statement as a band with Layne at full strength. Watching him that night Performing acoustic versions of songs that had defined a generation was like watching someone pour their soul out for public consumption one last time. His voice, still powerful but carrying new layers of weariness and wisdom, transformed familiar songs into something more intimate and devastating. The Seattle that had nurtured these musicians was changing too. The success of the grunge movement brought an influx of people trying to capture some of that authentic Seattle spirit. But authenticity can't be manufactured or imported. The small clubs where these friendships and musical partnerships had been forged were being replaced by larger venues designed to accommodate the crowds that now flocked to Seattle, hoping to witness the birth of the next big thing. Looking back, the early 1990s Seattle music scene represented something rare in American cultural history, a moment when artistic integrity and commercial success briefly aligned, when music created from genuine emotion and experience found a mass audience hungry for authenticity. Layne Staley's voice was the golden thread that ran through this tapestry, connecting the heavy riffs and the vulnerable lyrics, the anger and the beauty, the local scene and the global phenomenon. His influence extended far beyond the years he was actively performing. Singers from different generations and genres would cite Layne as an inspiration, not just for his technical abilities, but for his emotional honesty, the way he could make a simple phrase like, "I hurt myself today," feel like a confession that came from the deepest part of the human experience, became a template for vocalists who wanted to move beyond mere performance into something more transcendent. The legacy of that golden era lives on in the countless musicians who learned from Layne that vocal power isn't just about volume or range, but about the willingness to be vulnerable in front of strangers, to let your voice carry not just melody but meaning, not just sound, but soul. In the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, in the smoke-filled clubs where dreams were born and hearts were broken, Layne Staley found his voice and gave it to a generation that needed to hear someone singing their pain and their hope with equal intensity. The golden voice of grunge wasn't just about the sound. It was about the courage to let that sound carry everything that couldn't be spoken any other way. The legacy of that golden era lives on in the countless musicians who learned from Layne that vocal power isn't just about volume or range, but about the willingness to be vulnerable in front of strangers, to let your voice carry not just melody but meaning, not just sound but soul. In the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, in the smoke-filled clubs where dreams were born and hearts were broken, Layne Staley found his voice and gave it to a generation that needed to hear someone singing their pain and their hope with equal intensity. The golden voice of grunge wasn't just about the sound. It was about the courage to let that sound carry everything that couldn't be spoken any other way. The legacy of that golden era lives on in the countless musicians who learned from Layne that vocal power isn't just about volume or range, but about the willingness to be vulnerable in front of strangers, to let your voice carry not just melody but meaning, not just sound, but soul. In the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, in the smoke-filled clubs where dreams were born and hearts were broken, Layne Staley found his voice and gave it to a generation that needed to hear someone singing their pain and their hope with equal intensity. The golden voice of grunge wasn't just about the sound. It was about the courage to let that sound carry everything that couldn't be spoken any other way. But even as Layne Staley reached the peak of his artistic powers, shadows were gathering that would forever change the trajectory of his story. The same sensitivity that made his voice so transcendent also made him vulnerable to forces that would soon test everything he had built. The golden years were ending, and what came next would challenge not just Layne, but everyone who loved him. What happened when the spotlight became too bright for someone who preferred the shadows? How did the voice that defined a generation begin to crack under pressure? And what was really happening behind closed doors during those mysterious years when Alice in Chains seemed to disappear from the public eye? In our next chapter, we'll uncover the untold story of Layne's battle with fame, the recording sessions that pushed him to his limits, and the moment when everything started to unravel. We'll hear from the people who were there, who witnessed the transformation of Seattle's golden voice into something more complex, more fragile, and ultimately more human than anyone could have imagined. The curtain was about to fall on grunge's golden age, but Layne Staley had one more masterpiece left to give the world, a performance so raw and vulnerable that it would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The MTV Unplugged session was coming, and with it, the most beautiful goodbye in rock history. But after that final bow, after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience went home, Layne Staley simply vanished. For 6 years, the voice that had defined a generation fell silent. What happened during those invisible years from 1996 to 2002? Why did the man who once commanded stages across the world choose to disappear into the shadows of a Seattle apartment? The truth about Layne's final chapter is more heartbreaking and more human than anyone imagined. In our next episode, we'll step inside those closed doors, hear the voices of the few people who remained in contact, and discover what really happened during the most mysterious period in rock history. The story of Layne Staley's invisible years, where legends go to become human again. This is a story about isolation, friendship, and the price of fame that no one talks about. You won't believe what we uncovered.